You know, Reservoir Dogs may have introduced us to Quentin Tarantino's unique, non-linear storytelling, and it was and is a great movie. But then there is Pulp Fiction, and there really is nothing else like it. It may not be everybody's favorite, and that's fair, but it's generally the first film that comes to mind, and if you happen to look up the top 10 movies, there's a good chance you'll see it on there. It has a premise unlike any other, a lot of memorable characters, so it's not too surprising that there's a lot of stuff to get into. So I have again dug into the movie's history in the hopes of finding something you maybe haven't heard a dozen times by now. This is 25 things you probably, hopefully, didn't know about Pulp Fiction. The film was released in South Korea, Japan, and Slovakia before hitting America. Yeah, maybe not the most shocking thing out there, but the film was not originally shown in America. It was actually first shown in France at the Cannes Film Festival, in which it received the Palme d'Or, the highest awarded prize. It was shown at other festivals around the world before finally hitting American shores in New York, and was released in South Korea, Japan, and even Slovakia before opening in the US. It would eventually head out to Europe and Asia throughout 94 and 95, but it's interesting to note that America wasn't its first stop. It was a success before being released. Obviously, nobody was expecting this film to be what it was, but its immediate profit can be explained with some simple mathematics. The film cost $8.5 million to make. Bruce Willis, due to his current fame, ate up a lot of that budget. Such fame allowed Miramax to sell worldwide distribution rights to the movie for $11 million, and the $213.9 million it would eventually gross wasn't needed to ensure the film wouldn't be a complete failure. Confused? You won't be if you just replay it. I don't know what else to say. John Travolta researched his role by getting drunk in a hot tub. As you may expect, if you're gonna make a movie involving heroin, it's best your actors know what that feels like. Unfortunately, John Travolta never really used the stuff, and neither did Tarantino, but he was nice enough to hook Travolta up with an addict he was acquainted with to give him a better understanding of what it felt like, along with the advice to get wasted and lie down in a hot pool. He happily obliged, and despite having to explain this to his wife, it definitely paid off. I mean, he received an Oscar nomination, back when people used to watch that stuff. The Jackrabbit Slim set cost $150,000. You may think the iconic Jackrabbit Slim's diner was just rented out and decorated appropriately, but in actuality, it was made from scratch and became the most expensive aspect of the movie. To put it into context, that's John Travolta, and his salary is $140,000. In other words, less than the diner he's in, and at a time when John Travolta actually made good movies. The famous syringe shot was filmed in reverse. Don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of segments in this movie tend to conclude with things going batshit crazy. For that reason, I don't know if the syringe scene is the most tense or cringeworthy, but the way it was shot definitely helped. You see, rather than plunging the needle down and stopping just short, they instead shot the scene in reverse, having him start out with the needle in place and pulling it back. This allowed them to make it look as real as possible without putting Thurman in any danger. In the end, it definitely paid off, making one of the movie's most memorable scenes. Then again, you could have just done what Tom Cruise did and risk it, but honestly, I don't care if that knife's real. Lance was almost played by Tarantino instead of Jimmy. Unlike Reservoir Dogs, when Tarantino's role was second to last, this film would see him getting slightly more screen time. As we know, he ended up playing the iconic yet probably offensive by today's standards Jimmy, but at one point Lance was also a consideration. In the end, it came down to the syringe scene and that Tarantino wanted to be behind the camera when it was shot. I definitely think they made the right move, not only because Eric Schultz did a fantastic job as Lance, but also the character of Jimmy is just so fucking memorable, unlike some other, more questionable cameos. Roger Avary wrote the first material for the movie. Yeah, Pulp Fiction may be Tarantino's crowning achievement, but it was partly conceived by screenwriter Roger Avary, who wrote the first material way back in 1990 with the memorable gunshots miraculously missing scene, and Marvin's accidental death, which was originally written for Tarantino's script The True Romance. Obviously a lot changed, and Tarantino convinced him to take a stories by credit opposed to co-writer. It's rumored that this led to them falling out, but Avary did state that he's enjoying the residuals regardless, along with a Best Original Screenplay Oscar, so it's not a bad deal. Butch was supposed to be a lot younger and played by Matt Dillon. The character of Butch, obviously played by Bruce Willis, was originally going to be a lot different, and was almost played by Matt Dillon. Only thing is, upon receiving the script and apparently liking it, he stated that he wanted to sleep on it. This apparently annoyed Tarantino enough to take him out of the running, allowing Bruce Willis to grab the role instead. And as previously mentioned, this did lead to the movie's immediate success, so definitely not a bad move. Vincent Vega's car was actually stolen. In the movie, Vincent is seen driving a red 1964 Chevrolet Malibu, in scenes such as driving to the diner and eventually into Lance's house. Fact is, it actually belonged to Tarantino himself, and was stolen during production, luckily after the scenes where it was needed. It's a good thing too, because it kind of took them 19 years to find it. That is, in 2013, when two men were caught stripping a Chevrolet Malibu by a sheriff's deputy, and upon running the license plate, found that it was in fact reported stolen by Tarantino. Unfortunately, they merely just bought the car in good faith, and the true suspects were never found. And for whatever reason, we don't know if the car was returned. Maybe he just doesn't give a shit, and hopes that if they keep it, they might find the guys who stole it. I mean, he did cut off his own mom. You don't fuck with him. It was released the same day as Shawshank Redemption. October 19th, 1994 may sound like an average date, but as you've likely come to realize, it isn't. Not only is it the day that Pulp Fiction was released to US cinemas, but also the release of a somewhat famous movie known as Shawshank Redemption. It's not too surprising when you consider other films that came out that year, such as Forrest Gump, Speed, and others. But still, two of the debatably top 5 greatest films in history coming out on the exact same day would definitely lead to a tough decision given time travel is ever a thing. Daniel Day-Lewis was turned down for Vincent Vega. Yes, the Daniel Day-Lewis was originally lobbied to play Vincent Vega. And even though we couldn't imagine anybody but Travolta playing the part, it is hard to comprehend him being turned down. We can't deny it probably would have turned out great, but unlike many other actors that never were, this wasn't for any specific reason. Tarantino simply preferred Travolta and thought he'd be best. It's kind of it this time. The bad motherfucker wallet belonged to Tarantino. Yes, the iconic wallet, an unforgettable piece of movie history replicated by many. This is not too surprising. Obviously, it belonged to Tarantino. I mean, who else? Fun fact, the inscription is said to be a reference to the Isaac Hayes theme from Shaft. And oddly enough, Samuel Jackson ended up playing John Shaft in the 2000s remake and 2019 sequel. Needless to say, it's probably a good thing he insisted upon it. Jennifer Aniston was almost cast as Mia Wallace. And back to the topic of actors that never were, we have Jennifer Aniston, who was originally considered by Tarantino to play Mia Wallace. In fact, it very likely would have happened if not for a somewhat popular program known as Friends. In this case, I definitely think it worked out, as she got to be in one of the biggest sitcoms of all time, and let's face it, I don't think she would have outdone Uma Thurman. I mean, her only notable acting credit at the time was Leprechaun, so yeah. The Ezekiel 25:17 line was intended for From Dusk Till Dawn. Yes, another famous line that, just to clarify, was not really a Bible quote, was actually taken from the 1973 film Karate Kiba. And despite how iconic it may be, it wasn't originally intended for Pulp Fiction. No, it was actually written into an early script for Tarantino's vampire film From Dusk Till Dawn, which would eventually be directed by Robert Rodriguez, but more on that later. The scene would have consisted of Harvey Keitel's pastor character recite the line while walking backwards down the hallway, facing the vampires while incidentally holding up his famous makeshift cross. I can't argue with its inclusion in Pulp Fiction, but that does sound pretty damn cool. Tarantino considered Gary Oldman and Tim Roth for the roles of Jules and Vincent. So now we have something that is outright insane to even comprehend. Gary Oldman and Tim Roth were originally considered to play Jules and Vincent, the latter already appearing in Reservoir Dogs as Mr. Orange, along with the movie itself as Diner Thief Pumpkin, and the former playing drug dealer Drexel in the Tarantino script True Romance the previous year. This would have consisted of them having English accents to fit their heritage, and even though that may sound kind of interesting, I think it's for the best that that didn't happen. Robert Rodriguez directed some of Jimmy's scenes. Yes, Robert Rodriguez, a good friend of Tarantino for the entirety of his filmmaking career, did in fact direct some of the scenes while Tarantino portrayed Jimmy. This obviously went uncredited, but he did return the favor when he gave Tarantino a guest director spot for his film Sin City. It didn't happen till about a decade later, but pretty damn good scene. Tarantino wanted to use My Sharona for the basement sequence. I've tried to picture My Sharona in the infamous rape sequence, and it's definitely an interesting thought. Unfortunately, this kind of thing never really seems to work out, and the song had already been licensed to the 1994 film Reality Bites. On top of that, a member of the band was kind of a born-again Christian, so as you can imagine, that didn't jive too well. This meant he'd have to instead go with the Revels surf rock track, Comanche, which I personally think may have been for the best. The original movie poster can fetch you several $100s. While the movie poster alone could fetch you around $300, if it happens to contain the rare Lucky Strike cigarette logo, you could be talking a lot more money. Due to a dispute with the British Tobacco Company, they inevitably ended up leaving the case blank on the final version. So if you happen to own one and you don't value a piece of cinema history, then you're in luck, as fetching something in the thousands is by no means a stretch. Chandler Lindar's single acting credit. Considering the mostly notable cast, it's odd that the single kid in the movie never had another acting credit. Chandler portrayed a young Butch during the memorable flashback with Christopher Walken, and was respectively present during the whole thing despite the crude dialogue. He didn't speak during the scene, but his facial expression was pretty spot on. You'd think for that reason, along with being in a scene with Christopher Walken, directed by Quentin Tarantino, something maybe would have come of that. Then again, considering how child actors' careers tend to go, maybe it's for the best. The F word was used 265 times. Yes, it's no surprise that the word fuck was used quite liberally throughout the movie's runtime. Ranking in somewhere around the top 30 with the amount of F-words used, it falls just short of Tarantino's previous film, Reservoir Dogs, with 269 uses. However, considering the 99-minute runtime versus Pulp Fiction's 154 minutes, that's a lot more F-words per minute. Tarantino's acceptance speech was interrupted by a screaming woman. You know, some people just have no class. Or taste. During Tarantino's acceptance speech at the aforementioned Cannes Film Festival, a crazy woman who possibly had a thing against violence felt the need to heckle him with profanities in the French language. He managed to defuse the situation with a half-joking middle finger, and the rest is kind of just history. The nickname Honey Bunny was named after Tarantino's friend's pet rabbit. If it wasn't already obvious, just about everything in this movie has to come from somewhere. In this case, the nickname of the female diner thief is actually named after Tarantino's friend's pet rabbit. Linda Chen, the film's unit photographer, had an impressive role in the movie's creation, going as far as to type up the handwritten screenplay for him. So, having a connection between the thief and the pet rabbit is definitely a nice touch. Also, while this isn't technically a fact, the male thief's nickname, Pumpkin, is likely a reference to Mr. Orange. Because, you know, pumpkins are orange. Christopher Walken filmed his cameo on the last day of shooting. You know that scene with the previously mentioned kid when Christopher Walken explains to a young Butch about the history of his dad and how he kept the watch in his ass? Well, it turns out that was actually filmed on the very last day of shooting. This unfortunately meant he didn't get to hang out with any of his co-stars, but if you think the last day shot hindered the scene, well, then you must have not watched the movie. And then you shouldn't be watching this. Max Julien was meant to play Morales. Max Julien, a lesser-known actor, was originally up to play the role of Morales Wallace, the guy who ends up on the receiving end of what is not the last rape sequence in Tarantino's movie history. The problem is, he was in fact liking the script up until that point, which he wasn't okay with, and you can figure out the rest. I mean, I guess in the end you can't really blame him. I mean, it's better than Will Smith's reasoning. Jules originally had a massive afro. Possibly the least important thing on this list, and I'm definitely glad it didn't happen. An homage to the blaxploitation films Tarantino was a huge fan of, the reason why this didn't happen and we got the Jerry curl instead was kind of an accident. Simply put, a white PA was sent over to South Central to purchase the wig, and without knowing bought a Jerry curl wig instead, thinking it was an afro. This means she was likely cancelled by now, but in that case, it was definitely for the best. Because in similar fashion to the Nobody Shot Nice Guy Eddie incident, Quentin thought, hey, since the NWA is starting to get big, and they all have Jerry curls, maybe it's a better direction to go in. Samuel Jackson then tried the wig on, and the decision was pretty much unanimous. And that was 25 things you, well, hopefully didn't know about Pulp Fiction. Again, a lot of big changes, a lot of stuff that could have been different, but if, per se, My Sharona ended up playing during the basement rape scene, you'd probably think that was meant to be too. I am the analyst, and remember kids, heckling somebody is inappropriate. And if it happens to be Tarantino, then you're just gonna look stupid. So, you've made it to the end. That's an impressive feat indeed. Since you managed that, I guess check out the gaming channel, in which I cover a variety of gaming topics, like analysis videos, such as this one. If you're into that, then press the link in the description. It's that simple.